Many of you. All right, with that, would you give your attention now to the reading and preaching of God's holy word from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verses 7 through 11. And the title of the message this morning is An Entry Against Despair. An Entry Against Despair. 2 Corinthians 4, 7 through 11. Hear now the word of the Lord. But we have this treasure in clay jars so that it may be made clear that this extraordinary power belongs to God and does not come from us. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair, persecuted, but not forsaken, struck down, but not destroyed, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be made visible in our bodies. For while we live, we are always being given up to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may be made visible in our mortal flesh. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. Well, it's New Year's Eve, folks, right? Here we are, the doorway to a new year. Anyone really excited about 2024? Getting all stoked up for that one. Well, may it be. It's a presidential election year. Yeah, that ought to be fun, right? Who knows what's going to happen? We've got our Congress, which, of course, seems basically only able to fund the government operations, and that barely able to do as well. And then we have that great part of our nation known as higher education, right? That's going well. Everything's going well at our elite institutions. No problems there. We've got two wars that are raging, one in Europe, one in the Middle East, one seeming to be on the verge of expanding and spreading. A little closer to home in our own denomination, June of 2024 may well be a watershed event in the history of our denomination. We may well be splitting apart. And if all that isn't enough to lead you into despair, there's always the impending doom of climate change or the fact that AI is probably going to lead to the destruction of humanity, or at least making all of us irrelevant, right? There are a lot of reasons to feel a sense of despair about 2024, a sense of a lack of hope, a sense that things can't get better. They are going the wrong way, and there's no way out. There are a lot of reasons for despair, not just global and national reasons. There are also those very personal and private reasons that each of you may be feeling in your own way this morning. The despair that's caused by death and loss, by chronic illness and pain, by disappointments in yourself and in other people around you or institutions that you had put your trust in. Despair can be triggered by concerns about the welfare of our children or the state of our marriage and a variety of things. They're very personal things that can trigger despair. And maybe that's where you are this morning. Maybe that's what you're feeling, a sense of despair. I think we all feel that at times. It's a common human emotion. And if you feel that, you are definitely not alone. Because, as our text shows us this morning, the Apostle Paul felt that way. The Apostle Paul struggled with despair, and he shared that struggle with us. And also, he showed us how to deal with it. And he did that in his second letter to the Corinthians. And this morning, I want to consider that. I want to consider what we can learn from the Apostle Paul about dealing with despair, that powerful and often debilitating human emotion that we call despair. So let's dig into our text this morning. Now, when it comes to struggling with profound human emotions, most of us don't immediately turn to the Apostle Paul for help, do we? That's not his reputation. Most people, when they think of the Apostle Paul, don't think of him in terms of a sensitive, touchy-feely, emotional guy, right? Someone in touch with his emotions. That's not how people view Paul. Many people have very negative views of Paul and who he was. They think of him as kind of a cold-hearted, rational person, insensitive. In 2016, Randolph Richards and Brandon O'Brien published a book entitled Paul Behaving Badly. Was the Apostle a Racist, Chauvinist Jerk? And the blurb on the back of the book goes this way: the Apostle Paul was kind of a jerk. He was arrogant and stubborn. He called his opponents derogatory, racist names. He legitimized slavery, silenced women. He was a moralistic, homophobic killjoy who imposed his narrow religious views on others. And that's how many people think of Paul. Now, the authors to that book were trying to deal with that mischaracterization of Paul. They disagreed with that description. But the fact that the book exists, that they felt compelled to write it, is evidence of this kind of common, widely held view of Paul as someone who is insensitive, lacking in emotion. Even in places where Paul is revered, right? In circles where he's revealed. He's not revered because of his emotional sensitivity. He's revered because of his theological accuracy, his rationalism, his logic, his stoicism, not for his emotions. So it would seem that this is the last place and the last person you would go to learn about how to deal with emotions, to go to for insight. But ironically, he is the exact right person to look to. We should look to the Apostle Paul because he is, without a doubt, biblically proven the emotional apostle. The one who most shares his emotions. And the place that we see that most profoundly is here in his second letter to the Corinthians. Now be honest, when is the last time you read 2 Corinthians? I'm guessing not lately. You don't often hear it preached, right? It's kind of the middle child. It's kind of like, you got 1 Corinthians, woo, we all go there. Lots of stuff going on there, but 2 Corinthians, come on. And of all the Pauline epistles, when it comes to ranking them, 2 Corinthians may well come in last place. It's often forgotten, it's often neglected, but it is here in the second letter to the Corinthians that Paul most powerfully displays his emotions, his personal wearing of his emotions on his sleeve. Ralph Martin described Paul's second letter to the Corinthians this way, quote, he said, simply a pouring out of the man himself. It's in this letter of 2 Corinthians that this emotional apostle wears those emotions on his sleeve, pours it out. He shows his emotions to all of us, to those to whom he wrote and to us today. Stephen Vorwind, in Vox Romana, the journal Vox Romana, wrote a two-part series of articles on Paul's emotions in 2 Corinthians. It's one of the markers of this letter, 2 Corinthians. And in that article, he wrote this about Paul's emotions in this letter. He writes, specific references to Paul's emotions are found no less than 35 times, and 20 different Greek words are used. No less impressive is the range of emotions expressed. He despairs, experiences sorrow, is glad, rejoices, feels anguish of heart, sheds tears, loves, is perplexed, groans, has regrets, is afraid and jealous, mourns and burns with distress. Paul in 2 Corinthians is a veritable bundle of emotions. He's just pouring out of the man himself here. In that article, Vorwind even maps out Paul's emotions across the chapters of 2 Corinthians. If you could put up that slide with the chart. These are his emotions strewn across the letter, the high points of those. You can see those two peaks. It's chapter 2 and chapter 7. And that's where Paul talks about this very difficult letter he had to write to Corinth after a failed visit. It's a letter that's referred to as the letter of tears, where he pours out himself in tears to these people about this letter. Most scholars agree that while we have 2 letters to Corinth in our Bibles, it is likely that Paul wrote 4 letters, maybe more, at least 4 letters to Corinth in total, and they were all hard letters. This was a hard slog for Paul, this relationship he had in this church in Corinth, which was likely about the church of our size, about 200 people. He had this estranged, kind of difficult relationship with them, a relationship where he had to keep writing these letters, these hard letters, these letters of tears. He's just pouring out of himself, pouring out with emotion. And one of those emotions that he expresses here in this letter is that of despair. In fact, the word despair, this Greek word for despair, is used twice in the New Testament. It's used here only in this letter, only by Paul. Nowhere else it is here. Paul is not only the emotional apostle, he's the apostle of despair. The one who talks about it most clearly. You can take that chart down. Paul, the emotional apostle, Paul, the apostle of despair. And the 2 times he uses that word despair are in this letter. And let me just share with you how he expresses that in the letter. The first time Paul references his despair is in chapter 1, verse 8. It's right after he starts with his customary salutation, his greeting, his opening prayer of thanksgiving, kind of all those natural things of ancient epistles. And the first topic he launches into is his despair. 2 Corinthians 1:8, we do not want you to be unaware, Paul writes, brothers and sisters, of the affliction we experienced in Asia. For we were so utterly, unbearably crushed that we despaired of life itself. We despaired of life itself. That's in the Greek, that's such a strong, intensive word for despair. It's a sense of having no way out, no hope. He despaired for his life. So what happened to Paul? What happened to Paul in Asia that he's referring to that so led him to despair? There are much conjecture about what that is. Some say it was his fight with the wild beasts that he talks about in 1 Corinthians 15:32. Some say it's the severe illness or that thorn in the flesh he talks about. Some say it's a form of human persecution. But the bottom line is we don't know exactly what it was, but we do know it led Paul into the deepest sense of despair, despairing of life itself. And then, of course, the second time Paul refers to despair in this letter is here in our text this morning, verse 8 of chapter 4. We are afflicted in every way, but not crushed, perplexed, but not driven to despair. That's a really hard verse to translate into English, particularly that phrase, perplexed but not driven to despair. What Paul is really saying there is he really uses the word despair twice. Although it's translated perplexed but not driven to despair, he's really talking about despair twice, but with different levels of intensity. He uses the same Greek root word. They're related to each other. They have the same sound. There's only the difference is in intensity, perplexed, but not in despair. And in the Greek, there's a wordplay going on because the words sound like each other, and it's hard to translate that into English. Some people have tried to do that different ways. Here's a few: that Paul was at a loss, but not losers. That Paul was confused, but not confounded. That we may be knocked down, but we're never knocked out. I think the best one I found is he was stressed, but not stressed out. Or he was despairing, but not despaired, if I can coin that way of saying it. That's kind of like what he's doing here. He's talking about despair in levels of intensity, and he felt it. Now, why did he feel it here? What was the cause behind what he was saying here? What was perplexing him, making him feel despair? It was his ministry. It was his ministry with these people, his calling by God to be an apostle, and particularly a calling to them, and all the hard things he dealt with this group of people, and how they were attacking him and criticizing him and questioning everything he did, and how he had to write to them about all the problems there, and it was just getting to him, to the point he was feeling despair. If you take Paul's letters, the 2 letters he wrote to Corinth, that we have in our Bibles, it's 1/3 of the Pauline corpus. Like 1/3 of all that Paul wrote in the Bible are these 2 letters. And if you think about the ones we don't have, you can see how much he dealt with these people and how painful it was for him. And he was despairing over it, just like us. Paul was dealing with despair. Paul was an emotional guy, and he was acquainted with despair, but he found a way to deal with it. He found a way to deal with it. And so the question for us is, well, how did he deal with it? And can we learn from that ourselves as we struggle too with despair in our own lives? Paul found a way to deal with it, not to deny it, but to deal with it, not to dispense with it or to ignore it, but to actually confront it and deal with it. And I want you to see that, how Paul did that, so that we can learn from it this morning. So let's consider that. First, I want you to see how Paul evolved, how the text itself shows that Paul dealt with this, that he grew in his ability to deal with despair. And you can see that in those 2 references in Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 1:8 and 4:8. If you recall, that first time Paul talks about despair, he uses that intense way of speaking about it. He says that he's in despair, right? He's right in it, the deepness of it. He's despaired for his life. But in the second reference, and perhaps you caught it as it was being read, he says he's perplexed, but not driven to despair. Despairing, but not despaired. He's not in this intense place. Something happened between his time in Asia and here. Scott Hafeman in his commentary says exactly that. This move from 1:8 to 4:8 shows that Paul learned his lesson in Asia, and the question for us is, what lesson did Paul learn? What changed in Paul that he was able this second time to keep from going all the way into the abyss of despair, where he was on maybe the circumference of it, but he didn't go over the edge? What was it? Well, we get a little hint as Paul talks about it in 1 Corinthians 1:9, right after that experience in Asia, where he almost died, right? This is what he's despairing for, his life. This is a guy who was shipwrecked, he was beaten, he was in prison. Something happened in Asia where he looked death in the face in a way that was unparalleled in his ministry, that led him to despair, but God delivered him from death, and that profoundly changed Paul. In verses 9 and 10 of chapter 1, just after speaking of his despair, he said this, "Indeed, we felt that we had received the sentence of death, so that we would rely not on ourselves, but on God who raises the dead. He who rescued us from so deadly a peril will continue to rescue us. On him we have set our hope that he will rescue us again." Do you see what happened for Paul? Do you see how he processed what had happened to him? How he processed it in this matrix of death and resurrection, that he saw in himself as he faced death and God delivered him, the story, the narrative of death and resurrection, the death and resurrection of Jesus. One commentator said that in Asia, Paul had a near-death experience and a near-resurrection experience. The story of Jesus that he was proclaiming had become personal to him. He had inculcated it in his life. He had adopted the narrative of Jesus in his own life, the narrative of death and resurrection, of the cross and resurrection. And that for Paul was the key to deal with despair, of not being driven into it. Put up that next slide. You can see it here in the framework that we have in 2 Corinthians 4 with these antitheses that we have here, these contrasting things. It's a contrast of the cross and the resurrection. We are afflicted but not crushed. We are perplexed or despairing, but not driven to despair. We are persecuted, but not forsaken. We are struck down, but not destroyed. Paul began to interpret everything. His life, the world, and all experience through the narrative of Christ's death and resurrection. We would say in Reformed theology, through his union with Christ. That Paul saw himself having died with Christ, risen with Christ, and when he looked at anything in his life, he interpreted, he filtered it through that narrative. You can see it in the text in verse 10. In our text this morning where Paul says, always carrying in the body the death of Jesus so that the life of Jesus may be visible in our bodies. Paul was carrying the death of Jesus in his body. But he was also carrying the resurrection of Christ in his body. And when he looked at his circumstances, when he looked around at the world, he understood it in that light of death and resurrection. As Michael Knowles puts it in his commentary, the historical accomplishment of God's Messiah now provides the theological lens through which Paul interprets his own and all of human experience. He interpreted everything through the cross and the resurrection. And it was that kept him from going into the abyss of despair. You can take that chart down. In Paul Miller's book, The J-Curve, he talks about this very dynamic, and he uses the Jesus narrative to describe it, how this narrative of death and resurrection, and he talks about ways that people can process things in their lives, kind of narratives that people use in our world to deal with trouble and to deal with despair. He talks about 3 of them. The first of which he refers to as the victim narrative. And the focus of that narrative is on yourself, right? What's happened to you, protecting yourself. And the whole idea is how other people have hurt me and how that leads to depression and how that leads to anger and how that leads to everything is always wrong in the world. And how that can lead to you cultivating a self-centeredness or a self-pity of looking for a community that will share that with you, and how life never really breaks out of that narrative. Everything is about that. And it leads to despair. And then he talks about a second narrative that often we see in people in our world, the management narrative. I'm going to control all these circumstances in my life, make better decisions, and it's going to fix things, and I'm going to be able to solve all the problems myself through a careful management of my life and through maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain, but that doesn't deliver one either. It sometimes masks things, but it doesn't look things in the face. It doesn't help you to deal with despair. And then Miller talks about the Jesus narrative. And that's seeing your life in terms of the death and resurrection of Christ, of seeing the world and everything in connection with that. And what that allows you to do is to understand 2 things at the same time, to understand the reality of suffering, while simultaneously embracing the hope of resurrection. It takes seriously both things. It doesn't deny or look away from true suffering. It looks right at it in the cross. But then there's the other part of the narrative. The hope. The resurrection. That's the Jesus narrative. That's what Paul embraced here in this text. That's how he understood. That's how he was able to deal with despair in his life. He adopted the Jesus narrative for himself. You see, one of the most powerful things about Christianity is it can hold these things in tension. It can look at the reality of the world. We can acquaint ourselves with despair because we know about the cross, but at the same time we can have hope of overcoming it because we know about the resurrection. And you need both of those things. You can't defeat despair without being acquainted with it. You have to look it in the face like Paul did. Christian Wyman, who is a poet and a scholar, he's a professor at Yale. In 2008, he came out. He came out as a Christian in a scholarly world, in an academic world. And shortly after that, he was diagnosed with incurable cancer of the blood. That was 18 years ago, and praise God, he's still with us, very much with us. Not an easy journey for sure. He just recently published another book, a book entitled Zero at the Bone, 50 Entries Against Despair. It's from where I got my title from. In the introduction to that book, he writes this, he makes this point. To write a book against despair implies an intimate acquaintance with the condition. Otherwise, what would be the point? To write a book against despair implies an intimate acquaintance with the condition. Otherwise, what would be the point? Do you see what he's saying? He's saying in order to defeat despair, in order to overcome it, you need to have an acquaintance with it. And Jesus became acquainted with it in the cross. He was despised and rejected of men, a man acquainted with grief. That's at the core of our faith, and Paul understood that. He understood that level of despair, but he also understood what followed. And that's the difference. The resurrection. It's the key. It's the key to dealing with despair. Because if all you have is the cross, then all you have is despair. And beloved, that's what most people have. They have suffering, they have despair. They look at the world and there's only one way to see it for all of its suffering, through all of its despair. I just watched this movie with my family, a movie called The Holdovers. It's a very good movie, well done. It's really a movie about despair, about three people facing despair for a variety of reasons, due to loss, the death, due to mental health issues, family struggles. But the main character in that movie, Paul, played by Paul Giamatti, he's a professor at this kind of prep school, and he clearly does not believe in God in any way, makes that very clear. And he looks at life. And he has this great line in the movie, and I can't use it because I'll get into trouble. I can't use it exactly as it is in the movie. But he said this, and I had to mess with this a little bit, but it's close enough. You'll get the idea. He says at one point that life is like a henhouse ladder. You know what I'm talking about, right? Life is like a henhouse ladder. Short and full of scat. You know what he's talking about. That little ladder into a henhouse. Short and full of scat. Yeah. And you know what he really said. Christianity doesn't deny that. Right? The cross lets you understand that and look at it. But the difference is there's resurrection. There's resurrection. If all you have is the cross, if all you have is a ladder that's short and full of scat, that's what you will have, and you will have despair. But if you embrace the full narrative of Jesus Christ, the full story of the gospel, then you have something more. Christian Wyman, in an interview with NPR, he talked about that, about dealing with despair, about how the cross is not enough. You can't have just the cross. You have to have the resurrection. And he was speaking about Simone Weil, and he said this. He said, Simone Weil once said that Christianity would be sufficient if it ended with the cross, that God would so love humans that we would become one, that he would die for and with us, the sacralizing of matter by the incarnation, that this was miracle enough, the cross. And Wyman says, I can't agree. Resurrection is the final fruition of that miracle, but I know what she meant. This life is hard. I am a Christian because I believe it looks unflinchingly at and redeems that fact. Yes! The way Christians deal with despair is by looking at it in the face like Paul, by looking at it through the lens of the cross and then through the lens of the resurrection, because Christianity redeems it. It redeems even suffering and despair through resurrection, and therein lies our hope. Beloved, I don't know what you are dealing with today. I don't know what will trigger despair for you in 2024. But hear this hope of the gospel. Listen to the Apostle Paul, how he shows you how to look at it, but to also see beyond it. A way to understand what is wrong and yet maintain hope that it will be made right, that there is a way out, and that his name is Jesus. And that in his resurrection is our hope and our freedom from despair. Let me close with this illustration. It comes from Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. Interestingly, in that a story, Christian and hopeful at one time find themselves in the clutches of a giant. They get captured, taken captive. And the giant's name is Despair in that story. At one point, they're thrown in the dungeon of Doubting Castle by the giant Despair, and Christian and Hopeful are perplexed. They're at wit's end, and Christian turns to Hopeful and says, Brother, what shall we do? The life that we now live is miserable. For my part, I know not whether it is best to live thus or to die out of hand. My soul chooseth strangling rather than life, and the grave is more easy for me than this dungeon. Like Paul in Asia, they despaired for their lives. But then after a night of prayer, they wake up in the morning, and Christian realizes he knows the way out. He comes to the realization that he has the key, and that it had been with him all along. The key called promise. And he opens the door to the dungeon with the key he had with him, and they sneak past the giant, who's roused by the noise, but no longer able to overtake them because his limbs had become frail. And they escape the giant known as Despair. Beloved, I don't know what you will face in this new year. I don't know what I will face. There are uncertainties and certainly potential sources of despair, but remember what Paul teaches us here. Remember the Jesus narrative. Remember to see your life in terms of the cross and the resurrection. Remember to view all things through that lens. And it will see your way out of despair. We have the key. And we've had it all along. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, I pray for your people this morning, here and around the world. For all who feel a sense of heavy-heartedness and despair as they peer through the door of a new year. Father, help us to remember what you have accomplished. Help us to embrace it in our own lives, in our own bodies. Help us to see through the lens of the death and resurrection of our Lord. Help us to bring hope out of despair as you have done.